When King Henry VIII of England broke England away from Rome and started the Church of England and made himself the head of the church in England, he didn't change any of the teachings of the church. He had no desire to do that, to go in any Protestant direction. In fact, he very much despised Protestantism. He just broke away so that he could give himself an annulment to his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who had borne him a daughter, but not a son who lived to adulthood. And so he wanted to divorce her, or actually have an annulment granted by the Pope, so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, who was already pregnant with his child, that he assumed she would give him a boy. But when the Pope said there were no grounds for his annulment, that's when he said, well, then I make myself the head of the church in England, and I grant myself an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. And he married Anne Boleyn, who gave birth to a girl, not a boy, which upset him very much. She, of course, was the future Queen Elizabeth I of England. And then when she didn't give him a son, 3 years later, he got tired of her and he cut her head off and went on to his third wife. And then the story continues after that. But to make a long story short, too late, I know, he had no desire, a little late on the uptake on that. He had no desire to change anything about the teachings of the church, only giving himself a privilege. It was subsequent rulers who made the Church of England far more Protestant. Under the reign of his son, Edward VI, who was just a boy when he became king, the regents who ruled for Edward decidedly moved the Church of England into a more Protestant direction. And then further again under Elizabeth I, the Church of England became very much more Protestant, and only the Oxford movement in the 1800s started bringing the Church of England back to a little bit more Catholic things. But it was only then that things in the Church of England became more Protestant style. And some people in England had thought that they went too far with that they didn't want to go in a Protestant direction. They wanted to keep things the way they were. But while there were some who thought they went too far, there were others who didn't think they went far enough. And they wanted to go even further, even more into the Protestant direction than even Queen Elizabeth I had taken it. And a group of them got together and called themselves, he said they had to purify the church from anything that even smacked of anything Catholic. And so they said they wanted to purify it of all things Romish, as they called it, which was their insulting way of referring to things Catholic, anything to do with Rome and the Catholic faith. They wanted to purify the church of that. And so they called themselves the Puritans. And they weren't very popular in England. In fact, they were persecuted. And after years of persecution, finally they convinced the king at the time, James I, to allow them to come over to the New World and set up a colony here where they would be free to practice their version of the Church of England as Puritans. And the king gave them permission. And because they were on a religious pilgrimage, they called themselves Pilgrims. And in 1620, they boarded the Mayflower and came over to the New World and made their historic landing at Plymouth Rock and started the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And it's those pilgrims that we remember every year when we celebrate our Thanksgiving. But these pilgrims, in purifying everything Romish, as they say, apparently one of the things they thought was too Catholic was anything joyful, anything happy, anything that gave you pleasure. They correctly understood that that sins could bring great pleasure and that there were many sinful pleasures going on. But they went a little bit overboard, and they started not only trying to discern which were the sinful pleasures we had to avoid, but they pretty much threw out all pleasures and decided if you're enjoying it, it must be a sin. And so they were hardly a bunch of people that you would want at your party, not exactly a bunch of happy campers. Maybe it's no wonder that they didn't survive. But basically, they kind of felt if you're a follower of Jesus, you have to live in kind of gloom and misery every day. And because anything that's joyful is automatically sinful. Well, that's not our Catholic belief. We certainly remember when God put Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and there were many different trees there with fruit-bearing trees that were there. And the Lord said to them, you may eat of all the trees of the garden. Just the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat or even touch, or you will die. And that was A beautifully poetic way of saying, don't try to decide for yourself what's right and wrong, because I am God and you are not. I can't be deceived, but you can. He knew the devil was out there and was going to try to deceive them with sinful pleasures, to go after those things. So he says, just follow what I tell you, and you'll know which are the pleasures that I have given you that you can enjoy, and which are the ones from the devil that you must avoid. But of course, we know they didn't do that. They fell to the temptation, and we deal with the consequences of that to this very day. But it doesn't mean that we have to give up all sorts of joy and pleasure because some pleasures are sinful. We simply have to know which are which. And Jesus says today, remain in me. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And by following his commandments, we will know which are the pleasures that are gifts from God that we can enjoy, and which are ones that are tricks of the devil. Simply listen to the Lord, and everything will be fine. And as Catholics, we have been doing that throughout the centuries, and we've had no trouble celebrating the beautiful and joyful times of life. Even in our opening prayer today, we mentioned that we continue to celebrate this joyful season. And so we have parties, and we have celebrations, and we have feasts, and it's okay to laugh and enjoy ourselves. In fact, one of our Catholic historians, Hilaire Belloc, had once written, wherever the Catholic sun doth shine, there is music and laughter and good red wine. And we as Catholics do that. We know how to rejoice. We know how to be happy and celebrate, as long as we're differentiating between the joys, the pleasures that come from the Lord, and the sinful pleasures that Satan is trying to use to pull us away from the Lord. And of course, if things were just like the Puritans had thought, that if it was pleasurable, we have to avoid it, well, we certainly would avoid all of the sinful attractions, and maybe we wouldn't fall to them, but we'd also be guilty of the sin of denying the good gifts that God has given to us. And so we simply need to know the difference between the two. What are the pleasures that God has given us, and which are the sinful lures of the devil? And again, just following the Lord and everything he tells us, we'll know the difference. How do we know the difference? Well, we can tell often very easily in our own reaction. Sin can bring pleasure, but it cannot bring joy. And what is the difference between the two? Look at different actions, different things we can do. A sinful pleasure, when we're involved in it, it can be very pleasurable. We can be enjoying that moment. But what happens once it's over? The minute it's over, especially in good souls such as our own that are trying to follow the Lord, we're filled instead with guilt. The pleasure is over, and so is any good feeling that comes with it. And we feel the remorse of how could I have done that? The famous, I'll probably hate myself in the morning for this, is so much an example of that. But the pleasures that come from the Lord bring us to joy, which is something that brings us closer to God and remains. Think of something that you've been through in your life. I remember the first pop concert I went to. When I saw ABBA in concert for the first time, they were always my favorite. I remember that even to this day, I can think back on that day when I was only 16 years old and still remember it fondly. It wasn't over the next morning or the minute the last note of the concert was over. Or a good movie, or a play, or an opera, or something in the fine arts that lifts us up, that we enjoy and say, you know what, that helped teach me something, and it brings us closer to the Lord, and makes us thank the Lord, maybe even for the gifts of the actors, the musicians, whoever it was that that composed that piece of work, that moved us closer to them. Sadly, of course, in the fine arts, there are many people today who are producing, quite frankly, trash. Things that don't lift us up, but tear us down, that glorify the lowly, that go to the least common denominator, and that try to make money off attracting the sinful pleasures in the world. And those don't lift us up, and I doubt we would very much thank somebody or the Lord for that person having a talent to bring us down. But the ones that lift us up, what a difference it is. Here in our parish, just 2 weeks ago, we had our variety show, and we laughed and had such a great time with all the different talent that was only homebred from our parish, but it was just such an enjoyable day that people are still telling me today how much fun that was. We need to do it again, and that's a joy that comes from the Lord. When we go to a party and celebrate an event in somebody's life, Well, that's a good thing to do, to rejoice in an anniversary, a birthday, a wedding, a first communion, confirmation, a baptism. We're meant to enjoy those things. And so, as Christians, as faithful followers of the Lord, and especially us as Catholics, there should be a joyfulness about us. As Jesus says in the gospel today, I have come that my joy may be yours and your joy may be complete. And joy comes from things being the right way, the way they're supposed to be before God, the way God has created us to be. And if you've ever felt any moment like that in your life, that you say, wow, the Lord is close to me. I feel like I'm doing what he wants me to be. It fills us with such a peace, such a happiness. That's a joy that no sinful pleasure even remotely could bring us. And that's what the Lord came to bring us. Unfortunately, there are so many people in the world, do we not see, that are avoiding the Lord and not following him because they want the Lord to give them the sinful pleasures. They want the Lord to throw holy water upon a sinful act and call it holy just because they want it. And if they'd only realize that the Lord is trying to give us pleasures that will bring us joy, that are so far better than anything any sinful act could possibly bring us, that the pleasure of a sinful act is very fleeting, but the pleasure of a joyful act, of a good act from God, is everlasting. And that's what the Lord wants us to have. He wants us to be joyful people. He doesn't want us walking around gloomy all the time. Sometimes people think that a good, faithful Christian, if you're going to be faithful, you have to walk around with your head bowed and covered, with a rosary in your hand, beating your breast all day, saying, "My Jesus, mercy." Well, that's not a saint or a faithful Catholic. That's a fanatic. And the Lord is not calling us to be fanatics. He's calling us to be saints, to be joyful Christians, people who bring Christ to the world. Our saints, when we listen to the stories of them, they were all very joyful people. Our statues don't usually do them justice, because we usually show statues of saints in adoration or in ecstasy or something, or their head is bowed in prayer, which is all well and good. But look at the saints who have lived since the time that photography has been invented, and photos we have of more recent saints. There's one picture of St. Therese of the Child Jesus where she has this most beautifully beaming smile on her face. John Bosco, there's a famous picture of him that he has a smirk, almost looking like, what was he just up to? They were joyful, happy individuals. And even somebody from long before that time, from the 16th century, St. Teresa of Avila, who was one of our mystics and one of our most austere saints, once wrote, "From somber, serious, sullen saints, save us, O Lord. Lord, hear our prayer." I don't know if the alliteration works as beautifully in Spanish as it does in English, but even she, a great mystic who had moments of ecstasy, said we should not be walking around somber, sullen, and serious all the time. We should be rejoicing. And anybody who thinks that Catholics should not be joyful people, well, they're missing something. They've not really known Christ. Did Christ come here to say, in the gospel reading today, does he say, "I've come that my gloom may be yours and your gloom may be complete"? No, far from it. "I've come that my joy may be yours and your joy may be complete." Ultimately, that joy will be complete only when we enter the glory of his kingdom. But he gives us so many hints of that joy here and now on earth. And so, my friends, even just the beauty of springtime and the warmer weather and the parties and all the celebrations, enjoy them. Make sure they're free from sin, that they're within reason, that we're not becoming gluttonous and overdoing it with anything. Even God's gifts have to be done within reason and appropriately. But enjoy them and don't feel guilty for having a good time that was done properly and in the Lord. We should never have to feel guilty for enjoying ourselves in the Lord and for a proper good time done with the Lord's blessing. May we always remember to be joyful people and rejoice in the beautiful gifts that Christ has given us of saving us from death on the cross. That should be the greatest thing that gives us far greater joy, something to remember we were condemned, but he saved us. And that should give us a far greater joy than anything sinful even remotely could come near to bringing us. And remember, the Lord did not come and say, I've come that my misery may be yours and your misery may be complete, but rather that my joy may be yours and your joy may be complete. May Jesus Christ be praised. now and forever.